Welcome to Capitol Hill. Well, it was a character-building day for both major parties in federal politics. The government had another bad set of opinion polls. In the latest news poll, Labor's primary vote is down to 30%. It was even lower in the Nielsen poll, perhaps edging closer to the carbon price the government is yet to set. But even as her dissatisfaction rating climbs over 60%, the Prime Minister is hanging tough on her policy agenda. On the other side of politics, Tony Abbott was getting a little bit of a free character assessment from his former colleague Peter Reith over who voted for who in the Liberal Party presidency. And now he's unencumbered by high office. Peter Reith has left the door open to industrial relations reform. He more than wants to talk about it. And Tony Abbott's opening the door a little bit himself. To discuss the day in politics, I've been joined in Melbourne by Labor MP Kelvin Thomson and in Brisbane by Liberal MP Steve Ciobo. Welcome to you both, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, Lyndall. Good afternoon, Steve.
Kelvin, with a primary vote around 30%, is it good enough for the Labor caucus to just hang on and hope things will get better?
Well, Lyndall, no guts, no glory. You've talked about the issue of carbon price, and there's no doubt that that's impacting on our levels of public support. But the truth about climate change, as Al Gore famously said, is inconvenient. It would be nice if we were simply able to go on doing everything the way we have been doing. The truth is we cannot. We need to cut our carbon emissions, and future generations will not thank us if we walk away from this just because it gets a bit difficult or a bit hard.
But aren't these the poll figures? In fact, if you had slightly better figures, they'd be the sorts of poll figures that make backbenchers usually pretty nervous.
Well, we're a couple of years out from an election, Lyndall, and our task is to make the changes that we need to make in the best interests of this country, the best interests of this planet, the best interests of our children. And that is precisely what we're doing in relation to carbon. We need to put a price on carbon in order to reduce carbon emissions.
Steve Ciobo, you must be itching to go to an election now, mustn't you?
Well, look, Lynn, I mean, we think that this government doesn't have a mandate to do what they're doing. There's no doubt that Tony Abbott and indeed the entire coalition holds the view that this is a Prime Minister who largely got there on a broken promise. Prime Minister who said there'd be no carbon tax under a government she leads, but yet is now introducing one. What I've just heard from Kelvin is how the Australian public's got it wrong, and all the wisdom and knowledge is contained within the Labor Party, and only they know the way forward. The reality is that I think that what's going on is the Australian people are sending a loud and clear message, and that is they're not listening to Julia Gillard. One, they don't think she's got legitimacy, and two, they don't like what she's attempting to do, which is an ideological obsession with the carbon tax over the real world concerns that people have about their cost of living.
Do you think you can hold the support that is shown in polls like this for the next 2 years if the Parliament runs that long?
Well, Linda, I think that's putting the cart in front of the horse. I think what it's actually about is that if political parties actually listen to what the Australian people say, if political parties are in touch with the concerns and the aspirations of ordinary Australians, then the support follows. I don't think you can build a policy platform around getting support. I think what you need to do is listen to what people say, and in turn you'll be repaid with support. We think that Tony Abbott and the leadership group on the coalition is listening to the Australian people. We're responding to their concerns, and frankly I think it's in very stark contrast to Labor, who just stubbornly keep telling everyone else that they're wrong and that only Labor and the Greens know the way forward.
Kelvin, given the experience you had under Kevin Rudd, even if you thought that maybe you should change policy because it's not what the public wants, you really couldn't afford to back down now, could you?
Steve talks about listening to what the public say, Lyndall. That's highly entertaining. We were elected in 2007 on an express electoral promise to bring in a carbon pollution reduction scheme, an emissions trading scheme. The Liberal Party blocked that in the Senate, so they took no notice of what the people had to say. Last week, Tony Abbott was calling for a plebiscite in relation to the carbon price, and then said he wouldn't follow the result if it went against him. So the Liberal Party were not listening to what the Liberal Party have no intention of listening to what the public have to say in relation to carbon. In fact, The public has been calling for action in relation to carbon for years now. I frankly think that politicians have been behind public opinion in relation to this matter, lagging behind it. What we need to do is the right thing for the future, which is to put a price on carbon. It's not a question of collecting an $11 billion tax. The government is not trying to make money out of this. What the government will do with that money is to provide tax cuts, pension increases and the like. What we are seeking to do is to change the behaviour of large carbon polluting companies, moving them to a renewable energy future.
Steve, if Kelvin's right and what the Prime Minister is hoping is right, that when people see the carbon price, see it in place, then their fears will go away. That means you have a lot more work to do to build what effectively is a second string to your bow and policy, don't you?
Well, no, I mean, I don't agree with that, Lyndall. I think that we have, a very broad array of policies in a range of different areas. The simple reality is this, that I certainly hear personally, and I know that this is reflected among many of my colleagues, the views of Australians, and I hear it on the Gold Coast, as indeed people do across Australia, that they are really struggling right now with the cost of living. Power bills are skyrocketing, the cost of fuel has been going up, the cost of water has been going up, and people are saying, why is it when all of these costs are going up that Labor's looking at introducing a new policy that's going to make these costs go up even more? So, look, if Labor introduces this policy and people form the view that no, Labor's got it right and that we're wrong, well, of course, we're going to have to continue to reflect the view of the Australian people and the wishes of the Australian people in order to earn their support and their respect.
Steve, if we could move to the issue of Peter Reith and what he said about the Liberal Party presidency vote. He said that Tony Abbott rang him up and encouraged him to run. He thought he had Tony Abbott's vote, but Mr Abbott then voted for Alan Stockdale. Does that sort of statement from Mr Reith mean any problems for you, or is it a small storm that will blow over?
Oh, look, this is a storm in a teacup. I mean, I don't think too many Australians are that concerned about the Liberal Party presidency. The reality is, Lyndall, I've been in politics for a few years now. There's one thing that I know, and that is that you've always got to be up front about what you intend to do and the way in which you're going to vote. That's what I've always done. Suggestions that Tony's speaking out of both sides of his mouth to the two different candidates, I find that hard to believe. The reality is that Tony's been around politics even longer than me, and he'd know the folly of doing that, so I just don't believe that that's what's happened.
Kelvin, do you have some sympathy for the Liberal Party? Internal party reform is never easy. You've got your own round of reform to be debated at your conference at the end of this year. That will spark its own internal battles, won't it?
Lyndall, there's a massive question now hanging over Tony Abbott's head which he needs to answer to the Australian public and say, did he promise his vote to both the Liberal Party presidential candidates? If he did, this bespeaks a political tray which will be very troubling, this idea of trying to please everybody. So he says he's sympathetic to the flood victims, but he opposes the flood levy. He says he wants to reduce carbon emissions, but he opposes the carbon price. He says he's against animal cruelty, but he wants to resume the live cattle trade to Indonesia. He says he wants to have a budget surplus, but he opposes Labor's budget savings measures. You cannot in politics prosper if you want to please everybody and walk both sides of the street. So he really has to answer the question, did he promise his support to both candidates?
But if I could get back to the question, that internal party reform is a process you'll be going through as well. Could it prove just as difficult for you, or even more so?
Well, internal party reform is, of course, interesting to people in the Labor Party and people in the Liberal Party, but I don't think it's really interesting to the Australian public. What the Australian public want to know is, what are your policies?
You were just speaking about it at length, Kelvin. I mean, this is a bit rich coming from a political party that actually shares key positions among factions. I think that this is all, as I said, Lyndall, a storm in a teacup. It's not about what's important to Australians, and I think from most people's perspective, this will blow over.
Steve, if I could ask about the industrial relations debate, which Tony Abbott has opened the door to today. He says that he's happy if people have their say on industrial relations. Now, you've called for some changes in the past. What changes do you think the coalition should be proposing, or what would you like to see?
Look, I've always held the view that there definitely should be an exemption on unfair dismissal for small business. The simple reality is that the imposition of unfair dismissal is a massive hurdle for small businesses going out there and taking the risk of putting on additional staff. I also have always held the view that there needs to be individual statutory agreements available. It comes down to one word, and that is flexibility. We've got to make sure that there are safeguards in place, that people's workers' entitlements, etc., are looked after. They're the safeguards we need. Unfortunately, though, Labor runs this platform of saying, oh, work choices is coming back, everyone should be scared of work choices, and I've no doubt in about 15 seconds that's what we'll hear from Kelvin Thomson. Work choices is dead, buried and cremated. The reality is that Labor's policy is not sacrosanct. It's driving up wage price inflation. It's costing people jobs. It needs to be improved and reformed. And what we need is a little bit of maturity from the Labor Party to say, what can we do better without running some stupid campaign about work choices?
Kelvin, given the falls in productivity that we've seen, it's not possible to say that the Fair Work Act is perfect and doesn't need changing, is it?
I believe that the industrial relations policies that we have put in place provide genuine fairness for workers and genuine protections for employees. Now, Steve Chabot, he's a conviction politician on these matters, and I respect that. But the truth is, if you follow through his policies, what you end up is a situation where people can be dismissed unfairly, dismissed without cause, and when he uses a buzzword like flexibility, what that is code for is enabling employers to have workers working at nights or on weekends without overtime, without penalty rates. I don't think that's fair. I think that 9 to 5, Monday to Friday should be the basic working week, and if you're expected to work at nights or on weekends, there should be a penalty attached to that.
Steve, the AI Group, the Australian Industry Group, has put out a release this afternoon saying it wants changes, but saying given that the Senate's about to change, any amendments will need bipartisan support. Do you think it's possible to work with the government to get bipartisan agreement on incremental changes to the Fair Work Act?
Look, I hope so, Lyndall. I mean, I'd hope that there'd be a degree of maturity. And can I say, and kudos to you, Kelvin, I'm impressed that you got through that answer without mentioning work choices. Only last week, in question time, the Labor Party raised the spectre of work choices again, and honestly I think most Australians just are bemused by this. It was 4 years ago. We've said on the coalition side a million times it's a dead issue, we're not going back to work choices. What we're talking about are reforms that are genuine, that are needed, that are about creating employment and about creating fairness and keeping safeguards in place. If the Labor Party can resist the temptation to run back to the boogeyman of work choices, then I do believe that it's possible to get bipartisanship. I do believe it's possible to make the necessary reforms that will help to reduce pressure on wage price inflation, which is really starting to creep up now. And the inescapable reality, Lyndall, is that wage price inflation drives up interest rates. So it's one thing to say that it's all about workers' protections, but it's a different thing to say that this policy is having a very real impact on inflation and a very real impact on interest rates.
And that's where we'll have to leave it today, gentlemen. Kelvin Thomson and Steve Chabot, thank you very much for your time.
Good to talk
Pleasure,
with you.
thank you.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill. Be with us at the same time tomorrow.